coming in. We have some seats for them. I'm Bob Reeser. I'm the Associate Dean for Research here in the college. This is the biggest group I've seen in one place since I gave my bar mitzvah. My relatives.
That is true. Wise.
They're all shaking their heads. All right. So anyhow, as I said, I'm Bob Reeser, Associate Dean for Research. And but how many of you here are faculty members? Raise your hand if you're a faculty member. Let's graduate students. And how many of you have previously applied for IRB permission to conduct research? Okay, well that's why we're here, even if you haven't done it, because for a variety of reasons, mainly to facilitate the way in which we conduct research and get approved for research, the Office of Human Subjects is developing, in cooperation with some other groups, a new mechanism for all of this. So Angie Rowe, who works for Angie,
the Office of Research.
Okay, for the Office of Research, and Julie Haltiwanger, who many of us know very well, who's in the Office of Human Subjects, are here today to talk to us about the new research protocol that they're going to be using. Julie's going to start the conversation. We've got an hour-long presentation. You can feel free to ask questions as you're moving along. We're going to try to limit this to 60 to 75 minutes. At about an hour, I'll let you know that we're going to start wrapping things up. But I think we're going to get a lot of useful advice. So let me just turn it over to Julie.
And I'm going to let Angie go first, and then I will go second. So I'm just going to make a couple of quick comments. Good afternoon. I'm really encouraged that you all are here and taking time out of your schedules to learn some very important news. As many of you may have heard, we are implementing a new research system at the university, known as the Research Administration Management Portal, or RAMP. So this will modernize the way we handle research administration. We're implementing 5 modules. The IRB module is one of those. So today's workshop is supposed to help you get adjusted to the new templates we're going to be using for your applications. And so that will be launched starting this Saturday, the 20th. You'll begin using these new templates. So Julie will go over how to use the new templates. And then the RAMP IRB module will be deployed June 21st. So you'll be submitting these new forms through a new system before. So with that, I will turn it over to Julie, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about the project or about the process, if you need more information. And with that, I'll hand it over to Julie.
Once again, thank you all for coming. We're going to go through this slide presentation. Ask questions as we go, but try to keep the questions to the slide and not about your specific research. We can talk afterwards or through another conversation on your specific research protocol. So today we're going to go over key definitions. We're going to go over what the Human Research Protections Program Toolkit is, which we call it the HRPP. We're going to do an overview of the protocol template. We're going to talk about protocol writing and development, the timeline for implementations, and then we'll do questions and answers throughout. So the first definition I want to go over is research.
Before we get too further, we will have these slides available, and I'll send it out through some mechanism, most likely through the graduate student listserv as well as the faculty listserv, so you don't have to necessarily write everything down.
Right, and then everyone should have a copy with them now, but then also on our website is already under the training and educational, there is this exact presentation already recorded, so you can listen to it again, and there's also the slides, and then the Huron consultant has also done a PowerPoint presentation that's in 2 parts. So on our website, there are quite a few resources as well. So the first definition I'm going to go over is research. So research means a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, evaluation, and design to develop to generalizable knowledge. So if your project does not fit this definition, then you do not, then it's not, if it's not a research project, it doesn't need to be approved by the IRB. So the first thing when you're thinking about it, is this a research project? The next few slides talks about what are not. We're not going to go over those today. You can read those. Class projects are not considered research. If you're in your methods course and you're talking about the different types of research, and you're doing it for that class only, so you're not doing it for generalizable knowledge, or you're not going to turn into a poster presentation. You're just doing it to learn a method. That is not research, and that does not need to come through the IRB. So I just want to go make that one distinction, but you can look at some of the other things that we're saying are not research on those other slides. And then the definition of a human subject means a living individual about whom an investigator conducts research, obtains information or biospecimens through intervention or interaction with the individual, and uses study or analyze that information or biospecimens. And then the other thing that I always like to go over here with people is this definition has 3 parts. First of all, in order to be a human subject, and to make this definition, it needs to be both private and identifiable. So just because, and then the other key word here is whom. So as an example of what is not human subjects. So let's say I call the FSU HR department and ask, does FSU have a sexual harassment policy? And I talk to a living individual. I have not satisfied the whom question in this because I'm asking the person about FSU's policy. So I'm not asking the person about themselves, so therefore I'm not collecting private and identifiable data. I'm just asking her for the entity's policy. If I take it a step further and say, do you feel the policy is effective? Now I'm satisfying the human subjects because it's private, potentially it's her own personal opinion. She's thinking she's having a private conversation with me. So therefore that would satisfy the definition of a human subject because I'm talking to an individual about their private and identifiable data. So when you're doing this, those are the first 2 things you need to think about. Is it research? It doesn't meet the definition of a human subject. So when we're talking about secondary data, and we're going to go throughout secondary data things as the slides go on. If you're getting secondary data, and my favorite thing to say in our office is it depends. So I'll go over some of those it depends statements as well. If you're getting secondary de-identified data, and it's publicly available, that is not human subject research. So, but we do have a form that you can request that's a determination that we'll send you a letter back determining whether it is human subject or not. So if you're in question. We're going to go over the difference in de-identified, coded, and other things as the slides go on. But just always think about first before you fill out the lengthy application or this protocol, is this research that involves a human? So private information is information about a behavior that occurs in a context which an individual reasonably expects that no observation or recording has taken place. And information that has been provided a specific purpose by an individual, and that individual can reasonably expect it will not be made public. So an example of what is not private information. So if you're on Twitter and you tweet something and anyone can see it, that is not private information because you tweeted it for everyone. Now if you post something on Facebook and only your friends or people that you've accepted a friendship from can see your post, then that is private information. So once again, you have to think about in the context, how are people perceiving it? So if you're on a message board, if you have to log into that message board, then it may be considered private. So things that are in the public domain do not fit the definition per se of information that is human subjects. But if you take that information that you gather from a public site and use it to contact someone, then you are crossing that threshold. So that's how we always say it depends on a lot of things. So the next definition is minimal risk. Minimal risk means the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in of themselves than ordinarily encountered in the daily life or during the performance of routine physical or psychological examination or test. So this is the definition that the IRB uses to determine the risk level of your study. And this is just more information on that you can look at. So what are risks ordinarily encountered in daily life? We use the absolute standard, which risk encountered in the lives of normal and healthy individuals. So that is what we're comparing your research to, is what is the normal person going through? Is this part of their normal life? So if you're going to the doctor's office and they're doing an exam, or you're in a school setting and you're already taking tests, that may be their normal life. So that's how we're looking at things. We're not looking at, like, if we're looking at a study of, let's say, a cancer drug, well, normal people don't take Rowe, so that would be greater than minimal risk. So the toolkit that we're going to be talking about provides standard operating procedures, checklists, and worksheets, provides protocol and consent templates for creating compliant documents, includes an investigator manual to design and guide you through the processes and policies related to the conduct of human subjects. So we're going to be going over these, but this toolkit that has been purchased by FSU will be changing our operating procedures, and then we'll be providing checklists and worksheets for the IRB members to use when they're evaluating the project. Throughout this presentation, I will be referring to the checklist and the worksheet. Those are some of those are already available on our website, and more will be available in the RAMP system through the library. And you will, as the investigators, be using these checklists and worksheets. You will be able to see the criteria that the IRB members are using to evaluate your study, so you can make sure you have everything in the document that they're looking for. So an overview of the protocol template. So everyone was provided a copy. They're also on our website. So the protocol is a document that describes the background, rationale, objectives, design, methodology, statistical considerations, and organization of a research project. It is a living document and can be changed over time through the course of the research project. The protocol template from the toolkit will be required for human subject studies at FSU. But please note, if you change the document, you must send it back to the IRB for review and approval, and you can't implement that change until it is approved. So we're going to go through the actual protocol now, section by section. And once again, there is one that was pinned out, and they are available on our website. So the first section is the revision history. So you'll be using the same protocol document for the entire life cycle of your study. So we have a revision history section where you'll be putting in, and once we migrate to the RAMP system, it will help pre-populate some of this for you, where you provide the date and a summary of your changes. So your first version, this section will be blank, and then let's say in 3 months you need to change something. This is where we would have that revision history, so that you and the IRB can look at it and see how this document has changed over time. It needs to be a Word, yes?
Does that go for like multi-year projects?
Yes, this will be the same document you'll use for everything.
Start to finish.
Yes. So it needs to be a Word document. When we migrate to the new RAMP system in the summer, it has a feature called View Differences. So it can take the protocol that you've uploaded, let's say your original application, and then when you re-upload the same document in a revision, it can tell the IRB member what is different between those two documents, so that they can look for the differences and they can see what you have changed in your protocol. That's why everyone uses standard protocol, so that it can look for those differences. So the next section, section 1, we're not going to go over because it's just a summary of all the other sections that you'll fill out. So we're actually going to start with section 2. So section 2 of the protocol template is the objective. So the primary objective serves as the basis of your sample size, and the secondary objectives may be exploratory or hypothesis generating, and the study may not be powered to achieve these. And then also, I just want to note, if you're required or you are listing your study in clinicaltrials.gov, the studies typically have one primary objective and outcome measures, but it can have more than one secondary outcome. And then if you have exploratory objectives, those do not have to be reported in clinicaltrials.gov. And just also, clinicaltrials.gov is not for just medical-based studies only. There are educational or behavioral studies that do qualify for clinicaltrials.gov as well.
Julie, when you say the primary objective serves as the basis of the sample size, I'm not exactly sure what you're getting at. Does that mean you have to specify in your objective what the sample size is going to be, or the characteristics of the sample?
No, what we're talking about here is your objective statement. When you go in later in the protocol, we're talking, you'll get into your sample later. But we're saying you should do a power analysis and say, okay, I need 25 subjects to get this objective. So that's what we're just saying there, is whatever your primary objective is serves to help you know to get that sample size. So when you're doing your analysis, that's where you come up with that.
Is there sectional power?
No, there's not.
That's it. So it's only for your own edification that you need.
Right. Right. And these are just things that, and in the protocol document that's been passed out, there are instructions on what to put in each section. When you're filling this out, what you will do is delete those instructions and put the information in. The things that I'm going over on the PowerPoint presentation are just things that may not be in the actual instructions, or just some helpful information. So there are instructions for each section within the protocol document as well. So section 3 is the background. So this is the knowledge gap. So this is where you're going to be putting information about the background of your study, why you're doing the study, what other studies have already been done. This is where you'll cite your literature review and include your list of references for within this protocol. So the knowledge gap is what needs to be explored by new research, either because we don't know or know little or nothing about something. And this is where if you've already done a pilot study, you would mention that here. So this is your background section of why you're doing the research.
Did you say that, is there a word limit on these sections?
There is not. This is a Word document, and it's just, it's used as a template, so it can be as many pages as you need.
But for the purposes of getting approval for your research, I wouldn't expect my student to include his or her whole literature.
No, exactly.
Simple statement.
A simple statement, yes. You don't have to include your entire literature review. It's just one that there's key things that you think the IRB needs to know. That's what you would cite. So section 4 is your endpoint. So an endpoint is an event or outcome that can be measured objectively to determine whether the intervention being studied is beneficial or complete. Each objective that you have listed in section 2 should have a corresponding endpoint and a plan for analysis. So if you have 4 objectives, you should have 4 endpoints. So this is when, if you've reached your hypothesis or what you're going to end your study, or the outcome that you're measuring. So section 5, there's 2 different versions. So that the protocol that I have provided in front of you is the biomedical protocol. There is also a social behavioral protocol. The only real difference in this is section 5. Here it says study, intervention, and investigational agent. In the social behavioral protocol, it just says study intervention. It doesn't say the word investigational agent. It doesn't ask questions about investigational agents. So investigational agents that we're talking about here would be drugs and other medical devices. So if you're not doing a biomedical study, then you can use the social behavioral protocol, but do realize that we use the same regulations for all research. So when the IRB member's looking at it, we're looking at everything through the same lens. Yes?
And if you're doing qualitative naturalistic work, do you just say, I don't have an intervention?
You might not have an intervention, but you may still be doing a survey. So it'd be the instrument that you're using.
So the instrument is what you mean
Yes.
by the intervention.
And those sort of instruments are under the study intervention because they're not like drug.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. So section 6 is procedures involved. So this is where you provide a chronological description of all study procedures. You would divide those procedures into pilot, screening, and procedures performed at each visit. You indicate how many total visits, approximately how long will last, and then adequate detail is required to ensure that you research plans and you can do valid results. You may include tables, figures, or flow diagrams to show the time order of the procedures involved. So what we're talking about here is this section is your timeline or your protocol in the sense of I should be able to come in to look at your protocol and come into your research lab or your research setting and perform this research for you. It needs to be that detailed that someone could come in and say, okay, the first thing I do is this. The second thing I'm doing is this. If things need to be done in a certain order, then you need to say they need to be done in this order only. So if you have a pre-test, maybe an intervention, and then a post-test, you need to put the pre-test needs to be done first, then the actual intervention, and then a post-test. If things can be done out of order, you can say this is a list, but things do not have to be done in this order. The reason we're asking for these kind of things is this, when you're looking at your procedures involved section, this will help you determine if you have what's called study deviation. So let's say that you, in your protocol, you say things have to be done in chronological order. The pre-test needs to come first, the intervention, the post-test. Well, for some reason, someone comes in and gives someone the intervention, but forgot to give them the pre-task. That you have deviated from your protocol, and that may be reportable depending on what the deviation is. So that is the reason we're asking for things to be done and be very specific on how things are going to be done. So that this is what everyone in your lab or everyone in your group should be looking at this protocol document and using it to run the research. So in this section, that's where you're going to say, okay, we're going to have 6 visits over the school year, and this is what's going to happen at each visit. The data, specimen, and banking. So some of these sections may not apply to your research. And if that is the case, then you would put NA or explain why you're not doing it if you feel it's necessary, but you can put just the words NA. So what we're talking about when we say data and specimen banking is if you are keeping identifiable information about your subjects for future use in other research studies, or you're keeping the information for use later, even if it's not identifiable, you may still be banking that data. But if you're using identifiable data that you are banking or you're putting in a database for use later, then you should have a plan in place to track that data and specimen use over time. So this is part of the new regulations that came out in January. So we are still waiting on more guidance, but just for the gist of it, what I'm talking about is, let's say you're going into a school. You're having students do surveys, or you're looking at their educational testing. And the surveys that you fill out, you're going to take that information that's identifiable, put it in a database, and you're consenting the subject's parents, and you're asking them, may we use this data that we've collected on your child for future research studies without coming back to you to get permission? So this is the information that you would have about someone, and you're going to use it for future studies without that person's consent. But the caveat to that is, if let's say I said, yes, you can use my information in your data repository for future use, I can come back to you at any time and say, how have you used my data? And you have to be able to say, okay, I've used it in 5 studies. This is how it was used in those 5 studies. Or I have shared your identifiable information with these 3 researchers at this university. So we're not seeing that many of these plans in this way where things are kept identifiable. Most of this right now is just an industry-sponsored biomedical studies. But if you're sponsor or you think you need to do data banking, then you need to call our office and we need to have a conversation to make sure that you're clearly understanding this. Yes?
So videos of participants' faces would be considered identifiable.
Yes, that would
right?
be.
Is there a limit on how long those are able to be kept? Or do we have to specify like a kill date for those?
Well, once again, it depends on if you're using it for this one research study only. If you're only using it for your current study, then yes, you should let the subject know, okay, I'm going to be using your videos identifiably. I'm only going to have access, or I'm going to publish these, and they'll be used for this long. So yes, that is something, but that's not what we're talking about here unless you're asking the subject, I have these identifiable videos of you.
Right.
I want to use them in future research. I can't even tell you what it might be, but I'm not going to tell you about them. Okay. So that's what we're talking about here. And then I also, yes?
Does this relate in any way toward the movement toward putting your data in an open repository and all of that started, attaching it to your journal articles that's starting to happen?
Yes, that's what we're talking about. Usually when you're doing that, it's de-identified.
Right, but you said with the de-identified, still it might. That's
Right,
what I'm
that's
trying to sort out.
And that's what I'm going right now, the coded versus de-identified.
Okay.
So coded means the data is de-identified, but there's a key to the site where the code exists, even if you don't have access to it. So let's say we're collaborating on a project. I'm at the University of Florida. You're here at FSU. I have a coded data set that you're asking here at FSU to use. To me, at the University of Florida, the coded data set, because I have access to the key, is still human subjects data. But here at FSU, if you're never going to have access to that code, and the PI at the University of Florida will certify saying, to you, this data set is de-identified because I will never share the you can say at FSU that it is not human subjects research because to you it's not private and identifiable data. But for the caveat, once again, the it depends statement is if they send you that coded data set, even if you don't have access to the code, but you're going to be doing a data analysis, sending that data back to them, and they're going to be reincorporating your analysis in their research, then you are engaged in research still with their project. But if you're doing a completely separate analysis and not going back with the original, then we can say that is not human subjects. So once again, it's one of those you really have to think things through, and when you're getting these data sets, a lot of times people will use the word de-identified, but it's really a coded data set. So you just need to be really clear when you're giving out a data set or you're asking for a data set, is it coded or is it de-identified? Because there is a difference. If it's de-identified, all possible links to the participant's identity have been permanently destroyed. So no one can tell who they are. But if you are the PI of the project, or you are the person doing the de-identification, there's always the possibility that you may remember something. And so to you, that your own data is always, could possibly be identifiable, so it will be human subject. We're talking about data sets that you did not originate when we're talking about this, and not human subjects.
So then you wouldn't need an IRB for that de-identified?
If it is completely de-identified, you are not the person who de-identified it, then you would not need a human subject for that, because it's not both private and identifiable data. So it's not satisfying the definition of a human subject. Once again, if you're questioning it, you can fill out our determination form and we can go through that with you. Another thing that we ask, if you're doing secondary analysis of data that is human subjects, provide a list of the data element headers that you'll be using in your study. So that way we can see what you're looking at, and sometimes when you put more than one identifier together, the data is still identifiable. So if you ask, or if you have a data set, a small data set, let's say of 25 people, and you have race and maybe year in school, well, you may be able to, even though you don't have the person's name, it may still be identifiable. So that's why the IRB does ask for your data element headers, just so that we can make sure that you're not pulling information in that can now make things identifiable. So section 8 is sharing results with subjects. If you will return individual results or incidental findings to subjects, you must have the proper training or licensure to provide this information. So the example we give here is if you're doing an EKG on someone and you notice there's an irregular heartbeat. You cannot evaluate or convey to that participant unless you're a clinically licensed professional that they may have an irregular heartbeat. And for educational settings, if you are doing testing for, let's say, dyslexia or a learning disability, you need to have the proper training and maybe a licensure issue. Can you return those individual results to diagnose someone with that condition? So this is, we're only talking about here if you're sharing identifiable individual results with subjects. How are you trained or licensed to return those results? If you're not returning individual results, then you can put in this section in A. So section 9 is your study timelines. Tables are helpful here, and if you're doing a clinical trial in clinicaltrials.gov, you have 1 year from the primary completion date to enter your results in clinicaltrials.gov. So if you see the charts that we have here, we have a timeline that says what is going on in each month. Now things may change over time, and that's when you do a change in protocol to maybe say, okay, we got started a little late, our timeline has changed, or things of that nature. So section 10 is your inclusion exclusion criteria. The inclusion criteria defines who will be eligible to participate in the research, and the exclusion criteria defines who will not be eligible to participate and why. You cannot include members of vulnerable populations as subjects in your research unless you indicate in the inclusion criteria. and this includes incidental prisoners. So what an incidental prisoner is, and then I will go over some other definitions of vulnerable populations. So let's say someone is in your study, and you find out during the course of your study they have become incarcerated. You now have to make a decision as the researcher. Will they still be participating in your research while they're a prisoner, or will you be withdrawing them? So if you're going to continue with them as a subject, you now have incidental prisoners, and you need to let the IRB know that you now have a prisoner that's on your study. And when we're talking about vulnerable populations, if you have children in your research, part of your inclusion criteria needs to be minors, or people under the age of 18. So if you're in your inclusion criteria, you don't say under the age of 18, and you later want to add children to your study, you would have to come back to the IRB. So unless it is specifically outlined in your inclusion criteria, then you cannot include that person on your study. And you need to be specific. You should not say under your exclusion, if the subject does not meet the inclusion criteria, they will be excluded. And then the risk and benefits of a study depend on who the participants are. And the enrollment criteria also must be constructed to ensure equitability selection of your subjects. So what we're talking about here is you can't just say, okay, I'm looking for this population. I'm looking for maybe women who are bulimic, and say, okay, I'm only going to look at this certain age range, or say, I'm only looking at women when men could benefit as well. So that's what we're talking about here is the risk and benefits depend on who the participants are, but your enrollment criteria should be equitable to the selection of your subjects. Vulnerable populations are cognitively impaired adults, minors, pregnant women, and prisoners. And each one of these vulnerable populations has that checklist I was talking about. So, and we have a copy of the checklist on our website. So if you're using children in your research, there are certain protections on those children that the committee has to make sure that your study can fall under the guidelines where it's permissible to do research with children. So there is a checklist that the IRB member must go through to make sure your study can meet those criteria. So you as a researcher can look at that criteria and say, okay, yes, my study meets this, or I have this information so that they can make a decision. So some of the questions are, depending on the type of risk or benefits to your study for children, it may require 2 parents to sign the consent form. So when you're filling out your application, if you're trying to only have 1 parent sign the consent form, then you need to make sure you're falling in certain categories or you've made certain justifications. So these checklists are what the IRB members are going to look at and say, well, yes, I can provide the rationale of the application to where they fit for this or that. So always look at the checklist and make sure the IRB members can answer the questions that are in the checklist. And then a lot of times people will say, well, I don't know if a woman's going to be pregnant when they're in my study. So we're not talking about, let's say you're doing a Qualtrics survey, the woman's going to be sitting at her computer at home. That's not what we're talking. We're talking about when you're targeting the woman because of her condition of pregnancy. So if you're just doing a general survey and there's someone who may be pregnant, that's not what we're talking about. You don't need to check for pregnant women. Yes?
Can I go back to the minors thing real
Yes.
quick? What if there is only 1 parent?
Then there is this section on it that you would have to document that. On our new consent templates, there is 3 different signature blocks now. So we have 1 template for everything. So let's say you're doing research with children. So you would have a parental permission form. So you'll have our normal consent form, and then you would have 1 or 2 signature blocks. So if you're asking the parent to also be a participant, so if you're asking the parent to fill out surveys about their child, that parent is also a participant in your research. So you would have the parent sign the block for a consenting adult, but then you would also have a separate signature page where they're giving parental permission for you to approach their child. And that we'll go over in some other slides. So they're going to sign, there's going to be 1 form, but 2 different blocks for the signature. And on that second block where it's talking about parental permission, it will say 1 or 2 parent, there's only 1 parent, so that there is justifications for all of that on the form.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yes.
Just real quick about the consent form, what if you're asking people to sign but they're illiterate, they can't read or write?
We're gonna go over that, actually, there's another slide later about that.
Perfect, thank you.
So the section 12 is the local number of subjects. Local means any site the investigator's recruiting from is not defined by geographical area. So the example here is 35 subjects were recruited at Gilchrist Elementary School, 25 subjects will be at the FSU Communications Disorder Clinic, but the entire project is recruiting 300 subjects from multiple investigators across the state of Florida. The total local number of subjects would be 60. So what we're saying here is if you're doing multi-site research, we're wanting to know the local number of subjects that the FSU researcher is involved in. So if you as an FSU researcher are doing research in China, that would still be considered a local site here. So we're not talking about local when you're talking about geographical location. It's what the investigator is responsible for. So you can have multiple sites, but we're talking about number of investigators. So like if you have that where I'm talking, and where this example we're saying 300 subjects by multiple investigators. So if I'm the FSU principal investigator, I have maybe subcontractors at the University of Florida. They're getting 60 subjects as well. I'm not listing them as the number of subjects here. I'm talking about the number of subjects that you as the investigator at FSU are responsible for, is what we're talking about here. Yes.
Can I go back to the last slide briefly? Yes. So with the this letter with 2 blocks for signature, do you need 2 signatures if you have like checklists where it's like I give consent for my child to participate, I give consent for me to participate,
Yeah.
and then they just sign once? That's
no,
okay?
you will still need 2 separate. The new consent template does not have those checks. Well, you can have checks, but now you're having to get 2 signature blocks, and we'll go over that more.
Because I mean I had the new one approved, but it didn't have that on it, so I don't know.
It's just, we just switched to this one on March 11th. So if it was after March 11th, you may not, we're not required, and we'll go over, there's more about consenting in forms, and we'll go over the different templates and things in a few more slides. So that's what we're talking about when it says local number of subjects. It's how many is the investigator or the investigator team at this site responsible for.
So basically, if there are not multiple investigators, your local number of subjects is your total.
Correct. Yes.
Right. Nice to put that in.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a lot of, that's why we really try to explain it here, because the protocol template was designed by Huron and is being used at multiple institutions. So I'm trying to explain it for our group. So the recruitment methods in section 13 is described how potential participants will be identified and recruited for the study. You need to be specific and provide location names such as the FSU Student Union, the Bond Health Clinic lobby, and you need to upload all recruitment materials that will be supported for the recruitment efforts. All documents, images, advertisements that will be used must be reviewed and approved by the IRB prior to. So if you say you're going to hang a flyer in the FSU Student Union to recruit your subject, then you need to upload the flyer that you will be using. If you say you're going to have a Facebook ad to recruit your subject, then you need to upload a document that says content of Facebook ad. Whatever you say needs to be your final copy, or if it changes, prior to implementing that change, you need to come back to the IRB. And your recruitment sites can also be different than your research location site. So it may be that you're hanging a recruitment flyer in the FSU Union, but then you're asking them to come to your research library, your office here in the education, the Stone Building, to do the actual research. So you may have to make a distinction if you're having, later on we'll be asking you about locations or sites. You may need to be specific and say, this is my recruitment site, this is my research site. And then for your recruitment sites, you also need to provide permissions to hang information that you have permission to recruit from that site. So if it's at FSU, a lot of times that you might not need a permission. But like for the Bond Health Clinic, if you're asking to hang a flyer in a lobby of a business, then you need to have something from that business saying you're able to recruit from there. It may be an email, it may be a letter, but we need something that knows that you have approached that business. And if you're, let's say you're putting a flyer in Publix, they have a community board, well then you don't need permission from Publix, you can just say, I'm posting this on the community board at Publix, and there's not a requirement for. So you just need to be specific if a requirement of approval is needed or not. So section 14 is withdrawal of subjects. Subject withdrawal should be tracked and reported to the IRB either as reportable new information, which is called an RNI, or a continuing review, which you know is a renewal, depending on the reason for the withdrawal. So then provide the method that we use to notify subjects of their withdrawal from the study. So are you going to notify them with a letter, email, or in person? We need to see those materials. So we're talking about here, if you as the PI are withdrawing a subject. If they withdraw on their own, you do not need to give them a letter saying, you have withdrawn. This is if you as the PI are withdrawing them. So maybe they have missed too many study visits, or they no longer meet your inclusion criteria. You as the PI are withdrawing them, saying, you no longer meet my inclusion criteria, thank you for your participation. And you've written them a letter, or you maybe just said just like that in person, I'm sorry you no longer meet my inclusion criteria. And you're finished with my study at this time, thank you, I'm withdrawing you. But you also need to let them know if their data up to that point will be used or not used. And it should be clearly explained in the protocol and the consent form. We also encourage you to put investigator discretion as a criteria for withdrawal. So let's say you're doing a focus group and you have someone who's being obnoxious and is disrupting your study. You now can withdraw them under investigator discretion because it's up to your discretion. So if you don't have the word investigator discretion, then you may not have a way to withdraw that subject. So you just need to track how, yes?
This might be silly. Do we have to notify them?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, if you as a PR are withdrawing them,
Okay.
then you need to notify them of it.
Julie, oftentimes when we conduct research, some of our subjects aren't there for all the class sessions, or they miss one of the quizzes and so on, and then when we do our data analysis, we don't include them in data analysis for those very reasons. I would
Right.
imagine in cases like that, we don't need to report to you or tell them we're not including them.
Well, that would be considered, it depends on if you're withdrawing them from the study, or you're just saying, once again, like in your procedure sections, you would say, a subject can miss a quiz or a section of this, and that's okay.
What if I say it isn't okay?
Then, if you would be withdrawing them from the study if it's not okay,
It wouldn't meet the inclusion criteria.
or they would meet your inclusion criteria, and then you would still need to track it. So you could just simply say, at the time of your continuing review, I withdrew 7 subjects because they missed this, and then you're fine. Yes, but you still need to track it. Yes.
So in the context of classroom research, let's say, do you see a difference between, let's say there's something that's ongoing in the classroom and you have kids who've missed too many of the sessions, but they're still going to come and participate in the full class sessions because that's what they do. You're not actually excluding them from the activity that everybody else is doing, versus you're going over your data 5 months later and you're saying, I'm going to omit these records from the analysis. Do you see that as a difference in needing to
Yes and
inform
no.
them?
If you're doing it in the classroom setting like you're talking about, there's 2 different things here. There's normal classroom activity that you're not consenting them for because that's your normal classroom activity. You're consenting them to say, may I use the data that's part of this class for my study? And then you would need to tell them, your data may be excluded from the research if you do not meet the inclusion criteria, which may be you have to make 25% of this thing. So that's what we're talking about there. But you may not have to email them. You may not be notifying the subjects 5 months later when you're doing the analysis, hey, you didn't make my inclusion criteria, but you've already put in the consent form that says, your data may not be used if you're withdrawn.
So the bottom line here is if you're clear about what your inclusion
Right.
criteria are, then
You're fine, yes.
In the classroom setting, the subject is a student who has initially agreed to participate, but then withdraws from classes. You have to notify RFB and you have to notify the student.
You don't have to notify them. You would do the NAT notification at the time of renewal, where you would say, this student, I had one student withdraw from my class, they're withdrawn from the study. You only need, there's a form that's up already on our website, it's called RNI, reporting. You only need to report things to the IRB at that point if it meets that criteria that's on that RNI report. So an example of that would be, let's say that your study is a STI, so sexually transmitted disease study. And you have a, the subject come in, does the test, the lab makes an error, and you report you don't have a sexually transmitted disease. And then the lab comes back to you and says, oh, we made a mistake. That may be something that you need to report because that was unanticipated to happen on your session. That's what we're talking about, things that you need to report right away. So there's unanticipated or adverse events. But there's a form to help you make that decision. But other withdrawals or other problems you would just do on your continuing review. So section 15 is risk to subject. Each risk description should include the probability, magnitude, duration, and reversibility of the risk. And this information should be in the consent form in layman's terms. Risk should be described for each population. So if you have children and adults, the risk to your children and the risk to your adult may be different. And if you're having more than one study arm, then the risk should be described per study arm. So if you have a control group, their risk may be different than your intervention group. So if they are different, then you need to describe them differently. Or if they're the same, then you would put in this section, the risks are the same for all. All research has risks that may be unforeseeable or unknown. Do not use the verbiage no risk or minimal risk in the consent form. Clearly list so that potential participants can freely assess whether they wish to participate given the stated risk. It is up to the subject to decide whether they consider the risk acceptable to proceed with a participation. If you can't identify tangible risks, then you can simply put the statement as this is research study, there may be risks that are unknown. So the reason we don't want you to put the word minimal risk is, what is that minimal risk? You're not telling the subject what the risk is. It may be minimal to you, but it may not be to them. So that's why we're saying don't use the words, the risk to you is minimal, because you don't know how they would describe that. Section 16 is potential benefits to the subject. They should be described for each population and each study arm. Payment is not a benefit. It is a compensation. So if there are no direct benefits to the subject, make that clear. There are no direct benefits to you, but this is what the benefit phase society is. So section 17 is your data management confidentiality. If you take care in your data management, it's required so that you have results. Sloppy data handling will add variability to the study, and assessment will affect the outcomes. The more system the data, the more sophisticated methods should be used to maintain the data. If you are transporting data, include a plan on how the data will be kept secure during the transport. And then you need to maintain your study records, including signed and dated consent forms, for at least 3 years. And if you have HIPAA authorizations, they should be kept for 6. You should always have your records organized and ready for an audit. That could be from someone here at FSU auditing. It could be the federal government. It could be your funding source. And when we talk about transporting data, we also mean, let's say you're going to Kalra Lakes Elementary School, you're collecting surveys, and you have signed consent forms and identifiable data. How are you transporting those in your car back in a secure manner? Or if you have a research site in Boston, and they are getting consent forms signed, and they're sending that information to you here at FSU, how are you securely transporting that data from one site to another? It may be that you're saying, we're encrypting it and we're sending it through a Dropbox service. That can be, once again, it depends on the data of how sensitive that plan has to be. You have to have a data monitoring safety board only for more than minimal risk studies. Only the IRB can determine your risk level. But if you feel it's minimal risk, you can put NA on this section. And then if the IRB determines it's greater than minimal, you may have to come back and complete this section. But if your study is exempt or expedited, then it would not need a data safety monitoring board. This is only required for more than minimal risk studies. Privacy, section 19 is on your privacy interests. So this refers to the person's desires to place limits on who can interact or has access to their information. So this section, you're just going to say who has access to information. Section 20, once again, is only needed for greater than minimal risk studies, or we're talking about. So in your consent form and in your protocol, for here you can put NA. On your consent form, if it's not greater than minimal risk, you can delete this section. You don't have to come out and say there's no risk, there's no potential injury. You can just delete that section in the consent form. Section 21 is the economic burden to the subject. So this may be the travel time or expense related to transport to the research site or time away from their family. So you just need to identify that burden. Section 22 is your consenting process. If you notice, this has the word process. It does not say your consent form. The consenting is an ongoing process. And in this section, you'll provide the specific information regarding who will obtain consent, what format the information will be provided, what the consenting process will, when and where the consenting process will take place. Remember, consent is an ongoing process, not just a form, and the subject should be given ample time to make a decision. So it may be that your study is more complex, and they may want to take it home and think about it. Build that time in, or it may be that it's a study that they say, okay, I want to do it right now. But just allow them to have that time. And when we say who will obtain consent, you don't have to write a specific person's name here. You can say, my research assistants will be obtaining consent, or my graduate assistants, or the PI, or research staff. In the application itself, you will be identifying who those people are. But anyone who's engaged in research needs to have city training. And engaged means they're recruiting, they're getting consent, or they seek private and identifiable information. So the reason we say don't put a person's name here is we know that research assistants, graduate assistants come and go. We don't want you to have to update your protocol documents every time someone leaves or comes in new. What you can do is still a modification or a change in protocol and say this person is left, my new research assistant is this person, here's their city training, and you won't have to go in and update this protocol document. Yes?
So if we have the teacher in the classroom getting consent forms back from the parents, does that mean that they're engaged in research and need to do city training?
So let me go over that a little bit. So, teachers can be engaged in research. So an example of where the teacher's engaged. Let's say you're just having the teacher send home an envelope with the consent documents in. The student brings back that sealed envelope. The teacher simply puts them in an envelope, sends it to you as the researcher. That teacher is not engaged. But if the teacher is seeing that John is in the research project, she is now engaged because she now knows who your research participants are. So you need to make it very clear. Now, the student parents might not put it back in the envelope. She looks at it and says, okay, I'm not looking at this, I'm putting an envelope going on. But if the teacher is engaged in doing observations that usually the researcher would do, so the teacher's getting up in front of the class and saying, okay, class, I want you to fill out this survey for me. She's collecting all that data, getting it, and sitting it. She's engaged because she's interacting with your students, and the thing you have to be careful with school-based research, if I say I don't want my child to be in this research study, then that child should not be filling out the survey. So in that case, the teacher has to know who's in the research and who's not. So therefore, they're engaged because they're saying, okay, Johnny, your mom said you couldn't do this. You're doing this activity. Or here, John, you do this. Or John's going to a different classroom right now. So that's what we're talking about, engaged versus not engaged.
So just to clarify, the teacher, we're evaluating the teacher implementing an intervention, and she's collecting the type of data as a teacher you would normally collect. She's engaged in research?
No, she's a subject there.
Okay.
Because
So
they're
if they
the subject.
consent, if they consent,
Right,
they don't
they're a
have to
subject.
do.
But we don't want you just consenting someone as a participant to get around them having to do the city training. So if the teacher is the, but if the teacher is your subject, then they're not actively part of the research team and collecting the data.
Does everybody know what you mean when you say city training?
Okay, so city training is a program that FSU uses here that we purchase as a university and provide to the research community. And it's a training course that can take anywhere from 2 hours on. As I said, minimum 2. If you're doing it 2 hours, you are great.
You're amazing.
And we have different modules on different
You can
things.
do that.
So there, and if you're doing human subjects research, you need to do your city training or have your team do your city training. In our current system, you need to upload that data. When we go to the new system in the summer, they will pull the city data in every night. But in order to do that, you must use your FSU official email address when you register. Because if you register through your Gmail account, then it doesn't know to go troll and look for that. So, and also the same thing, the RAMP module, when we switch in June, it'll be through the secure portal. So if you don't have access to the portal and sign on information, you won't be able to get into the RAMP system. So you need to think about that as well. Yes?
Do you want to upload a PDF of each certificate or the link?
The PDF.
You
is
want
what
the
we're
PDF?
wanting. Yes. Yes. Not that I don't think anyone in this room would do it, but we have had people that will go into a document and change their expiration date. And then when we hit, there's a little button on your certificate that says verify, and then it takes us back to another screen that shows us the actual thing. So, and we are asking at this time that everyone upload their city certificates. Yes, because we have had people say, I have city training. And then we say, well, show us your certificate. Oh, okay, I'll get it to you. And then when they give it to us, it was dated like yesterday. And it's like, huh, well, you told us you had city training. So we are asking to re-verify everyone's city training at this time. And it should be within the last 3 years. Your city certificate is only good for 3 years. So if it's been more than 3 years, you need to redo it. You also need to check with your sponsors. Some sponsors require other training requirements. If you're doing a clinical trial through NIH, you're also needing to do clinicaltrials.gov or good clinical practices. So some sponsors have different requirements as well.
You said, so the city training, if you've already done it, then you don't need to do it yet, you just upload your.
You just upload your certificate.
But if it's past April 20th or something?
June. In June, you won't have to upload it. We'll be getting that feed every night in the system. And we'll be able to click on a little tab that says training and it will show us. But it has to be with your FSU email address. So if you've done the city training, but it's not under FSU, you need to go change that email address.
And what are the other trainings that you have to do? So you have to do city training.
So city training is the only one that we require, but your sponsor may require others, or school districts may require others. So this is something that a lot of people are struggling with that I want to go over. Non-English speaking subjects in the consent decree. A subject cannot be excluded due to inability to speak English if there's a potential direct benefit for the study. So, by saying that, if there is no direct benefit for your subject, you can exclude them if they do not speak English. But if there is a direct benefit to that subject or to subjects in your study, and you have someone that their primary or their first language is not English, then you cannot exclude them because they don't speak English. So you need to plan ahead and have translation services available for written and verbal communication. A lot of school districts have other languages spoken in their school. In this area, it may be Spanish, Korean, Russian. You need to be ready for that because a lot of times the children may be very well versed in English. The parents may not. But they also may know English but prefer to read the document in their own language. So if you know that you're going to have a large Hispanic population, you need to plan ahead and have your consent documents translated, and we need to see the certification of the person who translated them. Now, if you, the researcher, are fluent in that language, then you can sign a certification saying, I am fluent, I certify that this is accurate and correct. If you use a translation service or someone else, they need to just provide certification that is correct. But this does not need to just be the written document. You need to have a plan of what if that parent has a question. You have on the consent form that says, if you have questions, contact me at, usually has a phone number and email address. What if someone calls you and they speak Korean? Do you speak Korean? If you don't, then you need to have a plan. How are you going to communicate with this person? It may you say, I have a telephone number that I can call and we'll do a conference call and they'll translate for me. So it's not just to get the consent document translated and I'm done. You also need to be able to verbally communicate with those languages. And the short form consent process may be used, and in a slide we'll go over what the short form is. And to get back to where you asked what the person not read or write, then you would do you would ask for a waiver, and we're going to go over waivers in a minute as well. So when we're asking about waivers, you would say my population, may not be able to read, so I'm asking for a waiver of written consent, and I would do a verbal. So you would still give the verbal statements and everything to the IRB. So for parental permission, it's required to approach minors to gain assent. So you're not getting parental consent, it's parental permission. It's a permission form so that you can just go approach their child to see if that child wants to be in your research. Subjects over the age of 10 should be provided with a written assent form. So if they're under the age of 10, you're going to say you can verbally assent them. And you will provide that verbal script you're going to use, but you do not need to have them sign a document.
Yes. Similarly, can we get a waiver for subjects over 10 who can't read and write?
Yes. You wouldn't need a waiver. You would just say, because of this subject's age, I'm going to use the verb. Or if their cognitive ability, I would do that as well. And then if a parent is asked to participate in the research, they need to be considered for their participation separately. So that's what we're talking about. The parent gives consent for themselves, but permission for their child. So it's legally two separate documents. That's why we're having those two different signatures. Yes?
In the second setting, freshman students, you have students who are under 18.
So there's a few different things you can do here. You could put in your exclusion criteria, your inclusion, exclusion, under 18, over 18, or you can ask for what's called a waiver of the parental permission. So if you ask for a waiver of the parental permission, you could say, these children are in college, they should be able, I shouldn't have to approach their parent, but you have to fit the criteria in the checklist for waivers for that. So it's not practical to contact their parent, it wouldn't adversely affect their rights, or there's also sometimes when you're doing, let's say you're doing a study on HIV or gay and lesbian youths, maybe drug use. Well, you don't want to contact their parents and say, hey, can I consent your child in for this study on the LGBT community and drug use? They might not know their child is. So that would put the child at more risk possibly to contact their parent. So there are those instances where there's more risk that the committee may need to waive the parental permission. So when you have cognitively impaired adults, the determination of the subject's capacity to consent is an ongoing assessment. So if you're doing a dementia study, and it's a 12-month study, the person may have the cognitive ability to consent at month 1, but maybe not at month 6. So every time you're approaching your research subject, if you're doing an ongoing study, you don't need to have them re-sign the consent form every time, but you may say, hey, remember at the beginning of this study, we went over this consent form. Are you still willing to participate? You may have that conversation at every study meeting. And then you need to have a plan, so if subjects lose their capacity to consent while enrolled in your study, what would you do? So if you're working with maybe people who have had traumatic brain injuries, and when you consent to them, they may be able to consent. Well, maybe 2 weeks or later they're not. So you just have to think about that. If people may lose the capacity, how would you address it? Would you withdraw them from the study? Are you going to contact their legal representative to get them to continue in the study? You just need to have a plan for that, if that's a possibility. And then the process to document consent in writing. If you're asking for the short form to be used, so what the short form is let's say in your study you were not anticipating someone to need the Russian consent form. And you really want this person to be on your study, or there is that potential for direct benefit, but you don't think you're going to have any more Russian subjects. You can go back to the IRB and say, may I use the short form? And what that short form is it is your consent form. You don't translate your entire consent form. You just have a shorter form that says someone has went over and then you have a translator who's reading them the consent form. So you still have to get IRB approval prior to using the short form, but it's a way that you don't have to have things in languages that you may only have to use once. But the short form is just, like I said, for those ones you're not anticipating. If you're anticipating a language where you're going to use it more than 2 or 3 times, then you need to have the full consenting process. So that's what we're talking about here. And then when you're...
So how would you anticipate needing it, but then need the short form later?
Well, that's the thing, is you can't anticipate it. Let's say, like I said, like if you're going to a school system, and you have someone that speaks, a parent who's now moved to this school, and they have Turkish. Well, you weren't anticipating there to be any Turkish students, and you don't think there's going to be more Turkish students. You don't want to have to maybe pay for everything to be translated, because you have a translator service maybe that's going to provide that. But if you know there's a large Turkish community in your school, then you need to maybe plan ahead. Or if you say, like, wow, I've had 6 people now come to me with Turkish, I need to go ahead and have this translated because that's maybe part of my population. But if there's no direct benefit, you can say, I'm sorry, I'm excluding you from my study. But if there is a direct benefit to that subject, you cannot exclude them based on their language. So there is a checklist for written documentation of consent. And then the waiver or alteration of the consent process. So if you're asking for a waiver of documentation or part of the consenting process, then you need to ask for that. So what I'm talking about is if you're doing a Qualtrics online study and you're asking to waive the documentation of consent. So you're just having them click the I agree button. You're not getting their signature, so you're asking for waiver of the documentation. They're still consenting. You're still going through the consenting process. You're just not documenting it with their signature. So that's when you're going to ask for that waiver. And there's criteria that have to be met in order for the IRB to waive that element of consent. So that's what we're talking about when we're saying a waiver, or that would be an alteration of the consent process. If you're asking for a complete waiver of, I'm not going to even tell them they're in a research study, that is a waiver. So those are rare, the waivers of consent. What that would be used is, let's say you as a professor collected data 5 semesters ago, you didn't think you were going to use it for research, now you want to look at this identifiable information, and there's no way you can get a hold of these subjects again. You may request a waiver in that situation. Or a partial waiver would, let's say you did a research study 3 years ago, you didn't tell the subject you'd be coming back for follow-up, you now wanted to follow up with the subject. So you would come back to the IRB and ask for a waiver, a partial waiver, to ask to recontact the subject. So that's what we're talking about, a waiver, because if you don't have in your consent form that you're going to recontact them later, you don't have permission to recontact. So section 24 is your setting. So you're going to identify the research locations where research activities will be conducted. We need the names of the site, the address to the contact person. So for example, you would say FSU Main Campus, Deer Lake Middle School, and then provide official site approval letters for each site outside of FSU. Now I know if you're going to Leon County Schools, a lot of times sites will say, well, I won't give you approval until they give you IRB approval. Just write that here and say, my site will not give permission until I have your permission. They'll have started that communication. Just so that we know you've at least addressed it. And then some funding sources require community advisory boards to be formed to help design or be a part of the research. You would mention them here in your settings as well. Resources available is section 25. So you're going to describe the resources that the PI will have access in order to complete your research, such as lab space, a mentor, an advisor. And then you're going to describe the resources that will be given to subjects, such as first aid, referrals to services. So if you're going into the school system and you think the student might need counseling, or you're going to have the student maybe under some stress, then the resource you might say, we're going to provide the parents with a referral if their child needs to talk to someone. That's what we're talking about when we're saying resources to the subject. Or if you're having children do exercise studies, child falls down, scrapes their leg, you're going to provide first aid. That will be a resource that you're giving to your subject. So for multi-site research, so So this is research involving external collaborators. For example, FSU and UF are both collecting data, and there's investigators at each site. A reliance agreement may be required for multi-site studies. All NIH-funded studies must have one IRB. Starting in January of 2020, the new regulations state that all federally funded research must have a single IRB. So, on our website, there is a policy on multi-site and collaborative research. The FSU IRB only has jurisdiction on the FSU PIs or sites. With that being said, if you have a collaborator at the University of Colorado, and you list them in your IRB application, unless we have a reliance agreement with the University of Colorado, your IRB application does not cover their work. So, if you have collaborators and you want there to be a single IRB, then you need to have a conversation with our office about starting the reliance agreement process. Or if you're joining someone else's study, their IRB does not cover you unless we have an agreement in place where we're relying on them. Reliance agreements are not just a piece of paper. It is saying that if FSU is the IRB of record, we're saying we're going to do all activities on behalf of this other site, which has also adverse event reporting and continuing review. So we need to know about each one of your sites at continuing review as well. So in that example, the University of Colorado, when you're doing your continuing review or your renewal, you will say, these are how many participants were at this site, these are how many participants at this site. We had no adverse events at this site. We had no because the University of Colorado anytime can call me and say what's going on at our site, and we have to be able to tell them.
Did you say that's only for federally funded projects though?
That's what the law is. But we can do it or not,
Okay.
but it's required coming from the law. I do a lot of reliance agreements for non-funded studies, but that is on, we can take those by case, but coming up in the January we require.
So these reliance agreements are not like if we had one with FAMU, it would cover any research that we did with FAMU. It's on a study by study basis.
We can do it either way. There's different types of reliance agreements, and we can have that conversation. But it can cover just a specific study. It can say a different PI, or it can say all research at this site. It just depends on how we do the reliance agreement.
So there's no talk with FAMU about that?
Well, we do have one. All universities in the state of Florida have IRB agreements to rely on each other.
Okay.
We just have to enact it. So there's a form we have to fill out that tells each site, hey, we're relying on you for this study. We're relying on you for this study. So there is a form that we can enact for each university that has signed on. All universities in the state of Florida have signed that agreement.
So that makes it simpler, because I was told it was a complicated process.
It's not. I mean,
Okay.
a lot of people do it, just don't fill out the form, but you should fill out the form to make it official.
Okay.
So I can email you the form and we can work on that if we need to. So timeline for implementation. So starting this Saturday, it's not Friday because that's the deadline for full committee, it's Saturday. So starting at 12:01 Saturday morning, however you want to look at it, all new applications and renewals need to have a protocol, this protocol document attached, or we will not review it, we will send it back. So this protocol document is required for all submissions starting the 20th. And as part of the new system, only studies that have this protocol document will be automatically migrated to the new RAMP system. And if you're doing a change in protocol or a modification, you have an option to do it through our old system or to upload that protocol. If yours does not have a protocol, it will not automatically be migrated.
Once you make a protocol, can't you just copy and paste from it into the application?
Well, that's one thing. The next thing I was actually going to go over. So, starting Saturday, the application will no longer look like it's looked. The application will ask you 8 questions, and then you upload your protocol. So any information you're putting in your protocol, you will not have to type into our system. It's just in that protocol document. So the 8 questions are like, what is your, we already will have possibly your name and things like that in there. But the thing that we're needing is your FSU ID. So it's going to ask you, what is your FSU ID? That's not your email address, that's what you log into your portal with. It's going to ask you, is this a single site or multi-site? It's going to ask you some funding questions. So these are the 8 questions that will also be asked in the new RAMP system. So we're collecting it now so that we can migrate your data over. So you won't be filling out those 12 sections anymore, or the appendices. It'll just be uploading this protocol document. So it'll be a much shorter application, it's just because everything's in your protocol. Yes?
Will we continue to be able to access
Yes,
everything
we'll
that we've
always
done
have
before?
that system, yes, as an
Okay,
archive.
thank you.
It just won't, yes. And it will be, like I said, this new system is, you'll still use our current system until the June go live date. It's just we're modifying it starting April 20th to start with this new protocol.
And we did go through a process where we tried to look at the current HSRO system and migrate as much data as we could into RAMP, but there were some data integrity issues, and we only wanted to bring in good data. You know, we're having this new robust system, so we want to make sure that we have good data in it.
Okay, before this is scheduled to go to 3, and so we only have about 10 minutes left. I'm going to make an executive decision. So those of you who feel you have the information you need, first let's give a round of applause. For organizing this, we really appreciate it. Those of you who feel you've learned what you need to learn, feel free to go. Those of you who like to stay, Julie will be here to answer questions. Thank you very much.